the situation in Ukraine, full cooperation with the court by all parties is essential. Madam President, the fact-finding mission I established following the tragic incident at the detention facility in Olenivka on 29 of July is ready to deploy as soon as all necessary assurances are received. The missions must have safe, secure, and unfettered access to all relevant places and people, and to all relevant evidence without any limitation, impediment, or interference. Madam President, the situation at the site of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, located in the middle of a war zone, remains a cause of grave concern. The International Atomic Energy Agency is consulting with all parties involved on measures to ensure the safety of the plant and surrounding areas. I thank IAEA for its work. Its continued presence at the plant is an important deterrent. All attacks on nuclear facilities must end, and the purely civilian nature of such plants must be re-established. Any damage to nuclear infrastructure, whether deliberate or not, could have terrible consequences for people around the plant and far beyond. The world cannot afford a nuclear catastrophe. Madam President, yesterday's news that more than 250 prisoners of war were exchanged between Ukraine and the Russian Federation was a welcome development. I commend the efforts of both parties and hope that they will build on these with further exchanges, aiming at an all-for-all formula. And I thank the governments of Turkey and Saudi Arabia for their role in securing this agreement. In July, also with the support of the government of Turkey, a landmark deal was reached, enabling the resumption of food and fertilizer exports from 3 of Ukraine's Black Sea ports. More than 4.3 million metric tons of food have since been moved, bound for 29 countries across 3 continents. This includes 3 vessels chartered by the World Food Programme to transport desperately needed food supplies for the people of Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. A 4th left Istanbul today, and the 5th is on the way. Since the signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, global food prices have dropped sharply, although they are still almost 8% higher than a year ago. It is vital that these food shipments continue and increase so commodity markets further stabilize. The United Nations also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Russian Federation on the full access of Russian food and fertilizer products, including ammonia, to global markets. We are doing everything possible to facilitate these and to ease the serious fertilizer market crunch that is already affecting farming in West Africa and elsewhere. If the fertilizer market is not stabilized, next year could bring a food supply crisis. Simply put, the world may run out of food. It's essential that all states remove every remaining obstacle to the export of Russian fertilizers immediately. We need to get them to farmers at a reasonable cost and onto fields as soon as possible. Another major concern is the impact of high gas prices on the production of nitrogen fertilizers, and these must also be addressed without delay.
Madam President, there is only one way to end the suffering in Ukraine, and that is by ending the war. I will continue to spare no effort for peace in line with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. And I appeal to all member states, especially those here today, to redouble all efforts to prevent further escalation and to do all they can to end the war and to ensure lasting peace. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Mr. Karim Khan.
Madam President, Excellencies, Mr. Secretary General, it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to say a few words to this august council. This is a moment where we must collectively demonstrate by action, not words, that the law has meaning. It is critical that the law is seen to be on the front line, protecting those most at need. As we speak, in Ukraine and in many other parts of the world, the most vulnerable that deserve our attention. Children, women, and men suffer in agony and insecurity, and the law is looked to for real meaning and for accountability. But this potential that I'm convinced is latent in the law can only work by collective action. It requires determined focus by my office, by the court, but also by all of you. We must demonstrate in every location where violations are alleged and that the court has jurisdiction that in any conflict there are responsibilities. Anybody who picks up a gun, anybody who fires a missile must realize that the law is alive and not in slumber, and that accountability is absolutely essential. That requires determined action. It requires us to renew our pledge from Nuremberg that there's no statute of limitation for war crimes and to march forward together. Madam President, I'm convinced that if we coalesce around these basic principles of humanity, these basic norms of conduct, the law can play an ever more impactful role as an anchor for peace and security in Ukraine, but in so many other parts of the world as well. Since the beginning of the recent developments in Ukraine in late February, I have sought to ensure that the response from my office meets the imperatives of action and focus. In the 5 days between the 25th of February and the 2nd of March, when I made my initial statement and then opened the investigation, we have moved with some purpose. And the fact that 43 state parties to the Rome Statute, 1/3 of the Assembly in total, referred the matter to the court, signifies not only the crisis and the concern that is expressed, but also, I believe, an understanding that the law has an important role to play. We're now at the stage of continuing forensic, objective, and impartial, sometimes very painstaking work to grapple with the facts, to separate truth from fiction, and to build a picture of what actually happened. In May, we made the largest field deployment that the ICC has seen. And since May, we have had a permanent field presence in Ukraine. I can announce that next week, further members of my office will also deploy to Ukraine to look in relation to allegations emerging from the east of the country. And building partnerships, embracing innovation takes many forms. New engagements with states, with international organizations, and indeed with the private sector. Hopefully this new model of a more coordinated, more effective partnership, a more coherent approach for action will render this collective responsibility more effective. But the process of accountability, of collecting evidence and sieving it and weighing it and determining what is shown, is not simply an academic exercise. It is critical in order to pierce the fog of war, to actually present in a juridical forum the truth. And luckily we have independent judges, and when we have done our job, we will in due course present matters to the independent judges of the ICC, and they will further scrutinize our work very properly and decide where the truth lies. And this exercise is essential if we're to have confidence in the rules-based system. This function and this alone is the focus of my office. It's not a tool of politics. It's not driven by any other agenda than our obligations that are eloquently espoused in the Rome Statute and are underpinned with great eloquence in the Charter of the United Nations that created this august body that I have the privilege to sit in today. Through this work, a picture will emerge. And the picture that I've seen so far is troubling indeed. I have been to Ukraine 3 times, and one has seen a variety of destruction, of suffering and harm that fortifies my determination and my previous finding that there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed. And if I may, Madam President, be quite direct, when I went to Bushehr and went behind St. Andrew's Church, the bodies I saw were not fake. When I walked the streets of Boryadenka, the destruction that I saw of buildings and schools was all too real. And when I left Kharkiv, the bombs I heard land gave a very somber insight and a very small insight into the awful reality that is faced by many of our brothers and sisters and children that are in a war zone. I am deeply concerned regarding the allegations and the information we are seeing regarding what appeared to be reasonable grounds to believe intentional targeting of civilian objects, and also the transfer of populations from Ukraine outside, particularly children. These are priorities that we are focusing on. But our task collectively is to ensure that those responsible for any crimes that may have been committed, for any decisions that judges of the ICC may make, realize today, in real time, that they're masters of their own destiny. They have the choice and indeed the ambiguous responsibilities to act proportionately, to honor the principle of distinction, and to take all means necessary to make sure civilians and civilian objects are not targeted. Justice, as I've said, is not political. It is a vindication of the fundamental rights of all members of humanity. And it's a demonstration of promises that underpin the Charter and the Rome Statute. And in my view, the echoes of Nuremberg should be heard today. The failure to uphold the promises of Nuremberg that we have seen over the last many decades should act as a reproach on all of us. But leaders, not to despair or to despondency, but act as a catalyst for further action, to regalvanize us as a council, as international organizations, and as humanity, to finally, for goodness sake, to come of age and plant more firmly the flag of legality on the international landscape. So today, all I can do is recommit to my obligations and my oath as prosecutor of the ICC to do everything I can to engage with all international partner states, the United Nations, other international organizations, to investigate cases within our jurisdiction in Ukraine and beyond. The responsibilities that I hold and the much more powerful, much more relevant, and much wider responsibilities that you hold demand no less than we meet the challenges of today. We must demonstrate the resolve and the determination and the principle in order not to disappoint and fail those that are in most need of the law as we speak. Thank you so much.
I will now make a statement in my capacity as Minister of Europe and Minister of Foreign Affairs of France. Mr. Secretary General, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ladies and gentlemen. It is with a great sense of seriousness that I take the floor at this session dedicated to the situation in Ukraine, and more particularly to the crimes committed, the aggression that Russia decided to launch alone against a sovereign state, Ukraine, whose only fault was to want to live freely, constitutes a flagrant violation of the fundamental norms of our common charter, the United Nations Charter. The non-use of force, peaceful resolution of disputes, respect for the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states are principles to which we all subscribed uh, around this table. And each one of these principles was blatantly violated. The war, which began on the 24th of February of this year, has also been accompanied by atrocities and destructions of civilian infrastructure. These are so many violations of the laws of war and so many actions for which Russia must be held accountable. In Bucha and many other places, unspeakable crimes were committed. The liberation of Izum has also been accompanied by the discovery of new atrocities committed by the torturers. So the message of France today is simple. Justice must be our common imperative. There will be no peace without justice. Justice, of course, is an imperative for the victims, who have the right to recognition and reparation for their suffering, all their sufferings, of each victim. Justice is then an imperative of international security, and I say this to those who only see this war as just another conflict. If everything is permissible here, then it'll be even more permissible somewhere else, and the possibility of a war of aggression will only grow. Justice, finally, is a political imperative. We will need to ensure that individuals are held accountable for the crimes that they've committed, whether they have committed them, ordered them, or planned them. But it's the very idea that such crimes, that such violations of our common humanity are possible should be combated both in words and in deeds. For this, a framework was established, a professional and specialized justice. At its summit is the International Criminal Court, where 43 states, including France, referred cases to it. It's the very first time that so many states have referred a situation to the court, and it's a sign of importance that we attach collectively to what is taking place here. The court will act in complementarity, as you know, with Ukrainian justice as well as with other national jurisdictions, including the French jurisdiction and several other jurisdictions of the states present here. In this framework, justice must be upheld. France is working with many other partners to strengthen in all of its jurisdictions the collection of evidence and the collection of reliable information. This is why France has acted very specifically. As soon as information about the crimes committed in Bucha were known in April, we sent 2 teams of investigators to Ukraine. For 3 months, they've helped the Ukrainian justice to minutely and patiently reconstitute the facts. And we have donated a mobile laboratory to analyze DNA. Now that in Izum new atrocities have been revealed to the world, we just decided to send another support mission to the investigators on site, because where Russia is acting by using propaganda and disinformation, justice should be based on facts and evidence. Of course, we've also supported the ICC. We've provided financial support and provided magistrates, while of course respecting its independence. Our support is also to all the jurisdictions that should be able to easily cooperate amongst themselves, including to allow the International Criminal Court to take part in common investigative teams that bring together several national jurisdictions, including the jurisdiction of Ukraine. What we are doing makes a lot of sense. We're combating impunity, but we're also defending the integrity of our international order. The choice of war by Russia on a false pretext, it's blatant violation of such a notion as genocide, which is the worst crime of all, a crime that justified after the end of the Second World War, that the project of international criminal justice progresses. This is something that really is shocking. The International Criminal Court has itself noted the abusive conduct by referring to this this notion. And in fact, the population in conquered territory is subject to terror, and some threaten using every possible means, while we here refuse to be drawn into any escalation. In the face of those who deprive words of their meaning, our mission, our duty, our work around this table in this council is to give back meaning to things. And to conclude, I want to quote a Russian writer. We must publicly condemn the very idea that men can exercise violence against other men. By being silent about vice, we are sowing vice, and in the future it will only grow 1,000 times. End of quote. By writing these lines, Solzhenitsyn referred to decades of crimes committed by the USSR in its own territory. And those words very much apply today to the crimes committed by Russia outside its territory. The facts investigated by the ICC could constitute crimes against humanity. And we will investigate this, but already we must say that those responsible will be identified, they will be prosecuted, and ultimately they will be judged. For the victims, the wait may seem long, and for their families, but they must be certain, they must have the certainty that these crimes will not remain unpunished. We owe it to them. And it's not only that we owe it to them, but what's at stake is our security. And what's at stake are the universal principles that unite us. Thank you very much. And now I go back to my role as president of the council and give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Jonas Gahr Store, Prime Minister of Norway.
Madame Présidente, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Karim Khan, thank you for your briefings. This week here at the United Nations, I believe we have seen how we as a global community face dire challenges from war, climate change, energy shortage, food insecurity, and inequality. And we see how it is ordinary people who pay the heaviest price. Against this background, I believe it's our responsibility as members of the United Nations, and in particular, we 15 around this table, to chart a different path, one of hope and belief in what we can achieve together for our citizens and for humanity. The Secretary General underlined this eloquently in his address on Tuesday. And yet again today, we have the values and principles necessary to chart that course, and they are all enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, the Charter sets out clear principles for a rules-based international order, and sadly, this order is under attack. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a gross violation of international law, including the UN Charter, a violation of the core principle on which this organization is built, the sovereign equality of all its people and members. Madam President, I listened carefully to President Putin's speech yesterday, announcing a major escalation of this war, explained by a long list of allegations that Russia is being threatened from the West. Madam President, speaking for Norway, an elected member of this council, a European state, a NATO member, and a neighbor to Russia, let me say as clearly as I can, these allegations are simply not true. There is no military threat against Russia. There is no legitimate reason whatsoever to underpin a massive mobilization of Russian troops. This escalation will only lead to increased suffering for Ukrainians and Russians alike. Russia must abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and immediately suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine. Russia chose to start this war. It must now choose to stop it. None of the differences there may be between Russia and Ukraine can be solved by the ongoing military onslaught. So, Madam President, this General Assembly of the United Nations has reminded us of the global consequences of this war. Surging energy prices and increasing food insecurity are exacerbating the suffering of those who are most vulnerable. Not to mention the potential effects of a nuclear accident in Ukraine, which could have far-reaching consequences. The presence of Russian forces at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant severely compromises nuclear safety and security. We commend the IEA for its efforts in helping to stabilize the situation. But Russia's behavior is also hurting multilateral cooperation at a time when we need it more than ever. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is an important step to bring Ukrainian foodstuff back to the world market. As the Secretary General has said, it's multilateral diplomacy in action, and we commend his efforts to facilitate this initiative. Norway also expresses its full support for the Secretary General's goods offices. When the time comes, and it must come, we will stand firmly with the UN in the efforts to build and sustain peace. Madam President, in Ukraine, thousands of civilians, including children, have been killed. Millions have fled their countries, often separated from their loved ones. Many thousands have been welcomed in my country. May the day come, sooner rather than later, when they can return home safely to rebuild their country. The recent escalation of attacks on civilian targets is utterly unacceptable. Russia's indiscriminate use of heavy explosive weapons in destroying homes, schools, and hospitals. Unspeakable horrors were revealed in Bucha in March, and now in Izium and other places previously under occupation. Civilians have forcibly been transferred to Russia and Russian-occupied territory. And there are disturbing reports of sexual violence being used as a tactic of war. This must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Madam President, we also condemn the planned so-called referendums in the occupied regions of Ukraine. They would be contrary to international law, they be a clear breach of the UN Charter, and they would have no legal standing and no legitimacy. They would in no way affect Ukraine's sovereignty within its international recognized borders. Let that be clear. Madam President, international law is not optional, and as the prosecutor said, justice is not political. All reports of atrocities and human rights violations must be properly investigated and those responsible brought to justice. Norway has supported this effort and will continue to do so. There can be no impunity, as Madam President so accurately said. Accountability is key, but to ensure justice for the victims and to deter both to ensure justice for the victims and to deter future violations. Perpetrators must be held to account through national or international criminal justice mechanisms. This is why we welcome the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine established by the Human Rights Council, and Norway continues to fully support the International Criminal Court. The ICC's mission is crucial both in the context of Ukraine and globally. Madam President, let me end on this note. This war is a catastrophe for Ukraine and its people. Its ramifications have serious consequences for vulnerable people and communities all around the world. But let me say this, it is also detrimental to Russia itself, our neighbor. Thousands of Russian soldiers have been sent to their deaths in unnecessary and illegal war. Russian citizens are increasingly being denied human rights and fundamental freedoms in a society ruled with an even stronger authoritarian fist. If the Russian people, and we know them, could freely express their views, would they have chosen war? I doubt it. So, Madam President, democracy, rule of law, and human rights are essential. They are our best tools for promoting peace between states and accountability at all levels. They are also what we have to build on when we turn our back on war and destruction. We must defend these norms and standards and the values that underpin them. And again, the core principles are enshrined in the Charter. Preventing and ending acts of aggression is a direct responsibility of the Security Council, and Norway will continue to use the remaining part of its elected period here to promote dialogue and a peaceful settlement and fair resolution to this meaningless war. But we will also, Madam President, stand up for Ukraine's right to defend itself against onslaught and aggression, as we will defend our right to support Ukraine in its self-defense. We will speak up for international law, for the values of the United Nations, and take action for all people in need who are affected by this war, no matter where they are. Because this war of aggression is an attack not just against Ukraine, but also against the principles and values of the UN Charter. The Ukrainian people are giving their lives to defend these universal values and their own independence. And Ukraine can count on Norway's continued support in this struggle. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Stur, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Marcelo Ebrard Casaubon, Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, for their valuable briefings. I welcome the presence at this meeting of the Security Council of the Prime Minister of Norway and of other colleagues, ministers, and high-level representatives. I thank France, too, and you, Madam Minister, for having convened this debate on a flagrant breach of the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations, a violation of peace and international security. 7 months after the war in Ukraine began, its multiple social, economic, and political implications are clear. As in any armed conflict, civil society has paid the highest price. This war has led to massive displacements of people, both inside Ukraine and towards neighboring countries, above all, women and children. Property damage is also severe and burdensome. Since the beginning of the hostilities, Mexico has insisted on the need for a diplomatic solution and responding to the humanitarian dimension of the conflict without subordinating it to political considerations in strict adherence to international humanitarian law. In this regard, we sponsored with France a draft resolution which was turned over to the General Assembly and gave rise to Resolution E11-2 adopted last March 24. Today, we reiterate that humanitarian assistance continues to be a priority which is indispensable. We have also, to the best of our ability, supported the mediation efforts of the Secretary General, and together with Norway, we drafted a presidential statement to this end, adopted last May 6. This statement is evidently not enough, but it is the only public expression that this Council has been able to make since the beginning of the conflict. The progress of the war, with its enormous human and material cost, and the increase of humanitarian needs due to the conflict, such as the dearth of humanitarian supplies and the high cost of fuel, facing winter, we urgently require a solution through diplomatic means and a ceasefire. For this, we need political will of the parties and commitment from the international community. It is thus necessary to stress respect for international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Accountability is also another fundamental pillar of the multilateral system, the rule of law, and sustainable peace. For this reason, without any pretext or precondition, those responsible for crimes committed in Ukraine must be brought to justice. In this regard, the work of the International Criminal Court is essential to investigate the reports of alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. We will follow with the greatest attention the progress of these investigations. Greatly concerning is the dimension of nuclear risk derived from confrontations around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Ensuring its integrity and proper operations is critical to avoid the worst of any possible catastrophe. We support the recommendations made by the IAEA after its technical inspection. These recommendations must be followed immediately. We support the calls to create a security perimeter around the plant. Lastly, we acknowledge the value of the signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. FAO indices have shown that grain prices in the last 2 months have begun to drop. It is a demonstration of the value of diplomacy. Even in the midst of war, dialogue and agreements are possible. It is also essential to guarantee the access of fertilizers to global markets, and we are encouraged to see that specific steps already have been taken in this direction. We acknowledge the leadership of the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the President of Turkey in managing the aforementioned agreements. Madam President, since the beginning of the conflict, my country's position has been based on our constitutional principles of foreign policy, which are in accordance with the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly non-intervention, pacific settlements of disputes, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force. There is no space for ambiguity. Peaceful coexistence of states depends precisely on respect for all of these. There cannot be any exception. Over these months, we have been clear in reiterating the importance of Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations with regard to prohibiting the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state. Through our own experience, Mexico knows and well understands the importance of having the basic guarantee of being able to live without the threat of being invaded by another state. Any action violating this principle is illegal and illegitimate. The purpose of this organization and the mandate of this council is preventing the suffering of humanity from the scourge of war. But this can only be achieved through dialogue, diplomacy, and the building of effective political channels, the security of individuals, and territorial integrity of countries. Indifference is unacceptable, and also unacceptable is simply deploring that until now, in this particular case, the Security Council has not been able to fulfill its responsibilities. The reasons why this council is dysfunctional are well known. Correcting them depends on us. The time is right, but to seriously raise the structural reforms which are required for this purpose. Madam President, based on this vocation for peace, Mexico believes that the international community must now channel its best efforts to attain peace. In this regard, allow me to share the proposal of the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to bolster the mediation efforts of the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, by creating a caucus for dialogue and peace in Ukraine, with the participations of other heads of state and government, including His Excellency Narendra Modi and His Holiness Pope Francis. The objective would be very clear: generating new mechanisms for dialogue and creating additional spaces for mediation, which foster trust, reduce tension, and open the path towards lasting peace. Mexico's delegation will continue with the necessary consultations with the sole purpose of contributing as an impartial, good faith actor to generating broad support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary General and the aforementioned caucus, and we hope that it will be created with the support of member states of the United Nations. As the Secretary General just said, the time has come to act, to commit to peace. Resigning ourselves to war is simply to stand on the edge of the abyss. Thank you very much. I thank His Excellency Mr. Ebrard Casaubon, and I give the floor to Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America. Thank you very much, Madam, for having brought this council together at this very grave moment of the crisis of the war of Russia on Ukraine.
Determination and the moral clarity that you've brought to ending this brutal war and defending the UN's core principles, and also for your personal engagement in securing the vital Black Sea route for grain to flow once again from Ukraine. Mr. Khan, we're grateful for the efforts of the Office of the Prosecutor to investigate objectively and professionally the atrocities being committed in Ukraine by Russian forces, and for its support for and coordination with Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors. We hear a lot about the divisions among countries at the United Nations. But recently, what is striking is the remarkable unity among member states when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine. Leaders from countries developing and developed, big and small, North and South, have spoken in the General Assembly about the consequences of this war and the need to end it. And they've called on all of us to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter and its core principles, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. Even a number of nations that maintain close ties with Moscow have said publicly that they have serious questions and concerns about President Putin's ongoing invasion. Rather than change course, however, President Putin has doubled down, choosing not to end the war, but to expand it, not to pull troops back, but to call 300,000 additional troops up, not to ease tensions, but to escalate them through the threat of nuclear weapons, not to work toward a diplomatic solution, but to render such a solution impossible by seeking to annex more Ukrainian territory through sham referenda. That President Putin picked this week, as most of the world gathers at the United Nations, to add fuel to the fire that he started, shows his utter contempt for the UN Charter, for the General Assembly, and for this Council. The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it. Defending Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is about much more than standing up for one nation's right to choose its own path, fundamental as that right is. It's also about protecting an international order where no nation can redraw the borders of another by force. If we fail to defend this principle when the Kremlin is so flagrantly violating it, we send a message to aggressors everywhere that they can ignore it too. We put every country at risk. We open the door to a less secure, a less peaceful world. We see what that world looks like in the parts of Ukraine controlled by Russian forces. Wherever the Russian tide recedes, we discover the horror that's left in its wake. I had a window into that horror myself when I traveled to Irpin just a few weeks ago to meet with the Ukrainian investigators who were compiling evidence of war crimes committed there. I saw up close the gaping holes left in residential buildings by Russian shelling, indiscriminate at best, intentional at worst. As we assemble here, Ukrainian and international investigators continue to exhume bodies outside of Izium, a city Russian forces controlled for 6 months before they were driven out by Ukrainian counteroffensive. One site contains some 440 unmarked graves. A number of the bodies unearthed there so far reportedly show signs of torture, including one victim with broken arms and a rope around his neck. Survivors' accounts are also emerging, including a man who described being tortured by Russian forces for 12 days, during which his interrogators repeatedly electrocuted him and, in his words, and I quote, "beat me to the point where I didn't feel anything," end quote. These are not the acts of rogue units. They fit a clear pattern across the territory controlled by Russian forces. This is one of the many reasons that we support a range of national and international efforts to collect and examine the mounting evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. We must hold the perpetrators accountable for these crimes. It's also one of the reasons why more than 40 nations have come together to help the Ukrainian people defend themselves, a right that is enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The more setbacks Russian forces endure on the battlefield, the greater the pain they are inflicting on Ukrainian civilians. Russian attacks on dams, on bridges, on power stations, on hospitals, on other civilian infrastructure are increasing, constituting a brazen violation of international humanitarian law. This week, President Putin said that Russia would not hesitate to use, and I quote, "all weapon systems available," end quote, in response to a threat to its territorial integrity. A threat that is all the more menacing given Russia's intention to annex large swaths of Ukraine in the days ahead. When that's complete, we can expect President Putin will claim any Ukrainian effort to liberate this land as an attack on so-called Russian territory. This from a country that in January of this year, in this place, joined other permanent members of the Security Council in signing a statement affirming that, and I quote, "nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought." Yet another example of how Russia violates the commitments it's made before this body. And yet another reason why nobody should take Russia at its word today. Every council member should send a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must stop immediately. Russia's effort to annex more Ukrainian territory is another dangerous escalation, as well as a repudiation of diplomacy. It is even more alarming when coupled with the filtration operation that Russian forces have been carrying out across parts of Ukraine that they control. Now, this is a diabolical strategy, violently uprooting thousands of Ukrainians, bus in Russians to replace them, call a vote, manipulate the results to show near unanimous support for joining the Russian Federation. This is right out of the Crimea playbook. As with Crimea, it's imperative that every member of this council, and for that matter, every member of the United Nations, reject these sham referenda and unequivocally declare that all Ukrainian territory is and will remain part of Ukraine. And no Russian claim to annex territory can take away Ukraine's right to defend its own land. Putin's invasion is also distracting this council, in fact, the entire UN system, from working on the serious issues that we all want to focus on, like preventing a climate catastrophe, aiding tens of millions of people on the brink of famine, fulfilling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, shoring up our interconnected health security, all issues that make a tangible difference in the lives of the citizens that we are here to represent, and that they are looking to us to deliver on. The overwhelming majority of UN member states are committed to working together on these issues, and our actions show that. Yet, while more than 100 countries have signed on to a roadmap to provide food aid to those who need it, and partners across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe are working together to increase the resilience of global food systems, Russia for months blocked the export of Ukrainian grain to the world until the United Nations and Turkey secured a deal to let the grain go. And Russia continues to bomb and seize Ukrainian farms and silos, line its wheat fields with landmines, raising the cost of food for people everywhere. And while governments around the world are teaming up with international organizations, with the private sector, with philanthropies, to end this pandemic and make sure that we're better prepared for the next one, Russia is spreading misinformation and disinformation about WHO-approved vaccines, fueling vaccine hesitancy that puts people in all our countries at greater risk. Here's the reality. None of us chose this war. Not the Ukrainians, who knew the crushing toll it would take. Not the United States, which warned that it was coming and worked to prevent it. Not the vast majority of countries at the United Nations. And neither did our people, or the people of virtually every UN member state, who are feeling the war's consequences in greater food insecurity and higher energy prices. Nor did the Russian mothers and fathers, whose children are being sent off to fight and die in this war, or the Russian citizens who continue to risk their freedom to protest against it, including those who came out into the streets of Moscow after President Putin announced his mobilization to chant, "Let our children live." Indeed, it must be asked, how has this aggression against Ukraine by President Putin improved the lives or prospects of a single Russian citizen? One man chose this war. One man can end it. Because if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. That's why we will continue to support Ukraine as it defends itself and strengthen its hand to achieve a diplomatic solution on just terms at a negotiating table. As President Zelensky has said repeatedly, diplomacy is the only way to end this war. But diplomacy cannot and must not be used as a cudgel to impose on Ukraine a settlement that cuts against the UN Charter or rewards Russia for violating it. President Putin is making his choice. Now, it's up to all of our countries to make ours. Tell President Putin to stop the horror that he started. Tell him to stop putting his interests above the interests of the rest of the world, including his own people. Tell him to stop debasing this council and everything it stands for. We, the people of the United Nations, determined. That is how the preamble of the UN Charter starts. Let's not forget that we, the peoples, still get to choose the fate of this institution and our world. The stakes are clear. The choice is ours. Let's make the right choice for the world that we want and that our people so desperately deserve. Thank you.
Je remercie son...
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Blinken, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Wang Yi, State Councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs of China.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, I thank Foreign Minister Colonna for convening today's ministerial meeting, and I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. China's position on Ukraine is consistent and clear. President Xi Jinping pointed out that the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and the principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The reasonable security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts that could help resolve the crisis should be supported. China follows Ukraine's humanitarian situation very closely and has assisted Ukraine with 35 million yuan of humanitarian supplies. This year, we have provided other developing countries with 15,000 tons of emergency humanitarian food assistance and contributed positively to easing the global food crisis. In response to the current situation, China would like to make the following 4 proposals. First, we must stick to dialogue and negotiations. The top priority is for the parties to resume dialogue without precondition, commit to dialogue without presuming the outcome, include reasonable concerns into negotiations, and put feasible options on the table so that the talks can produce results and bring about peace. Second, we must work together for de-escalation. The parties concerned should exercise restraint and avoid escalating tensions. The international community should play a constructive role to help de-escalate and create conditions and space for political settlement. When it comes to the safety and security of nuclear facilities, there is no room for trial and error. Accidents and risks must be prevented. We support the IAEA in upholding a fair and objective position and playing a positive role. Third, we must earnestly ease the humanitarian situation. It is vital to observe the international humanitarian law, prevent any attacks against civilians, civilian facilities, and minimize civilian casualties. Investigations into violations of the international humanitarian law should be objective and fair, based on facts rather than an assumption of guilt and without being politicized. The international community needs to support the UN humanitarian agencies in upholding neutrality and equity and continue to provide assistance to those affected in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Fourth, we must contain spillovers. Energy suppliers and consumers should work together to keep the global energy market stable. We support the Secretary General in helping facilitate the exports of Russian and Ukrainian grains. China, on its part, has put forth the International Food Security Cooperation Initiative, and we welcome positive response from all countries. No country should resort to arbitrary unilateral sanctions, still less let developing countries pay the price. Madam President, the Security Council, as the core of the collective security mechanism, should uphold the basic principles of objectivity and impartiality on the issue of Ukraine, keep to the right direction of ceasefire and peace talks, and prioritize mediation tools in the pursuit of settlement. We need to pour positive energy for peace and reconciliation and take constructive and responsible actions towards political settlement. The Ukraine crisis is closely linked to the international situation. The more challenging the situation is, the more important it is to stay united and seek cooperation. We must work in coordination to uphold the UN-centered international system, abide by the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, accommodate the legitimate concerns of all parties, abandon hegemonism and power politics, and prevent any form of hot war or the so-called new Cold War. Let us commit to common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, seek common ground despite differences, accommodate and understand each other, and work tirelessly for restoring security in Europe and peace in the world. Thank you.
Je remercie son
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Wang, for his statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Olta Jaishankar, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Madam President, I join other colleagues to thank France for convening today's briefing and Minister Colonna for chairing it. This issue has been without interruption on the agenda of the Council, but this meeting could not be timelier given the latest escalatory declarations by Kremlin. I also welcome the decision of the French presidency of the Council to continue keeping the focus on accountability, an issue of the utmost importance that we initiated together back in April with the ARIA Formula meeting that Albania and France organized jointly. I also thank ICC Prosecutor General Khan for his information and his tireless efforts to establish accountability in Ukraine. Madam President, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, has waged an illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. In our judgment and in the eyes of the entire world, as clearly expressed more than once here in the United Nations, Russia's actions are a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Let's not forget that the highest international justice body, the International Court of Justice, has ordered Russia to suspend its military operation in Ukraine. International law is the same and mandatory for all. Russia has unfortunately chosen to openly and continuously ignore it. The very principle and belief upon which the UN was founded was that the only way to prevent war was through universal norms and laws accepted by all in the new post-World War II order. In the decades since, despite the challenges and difficulties, we have all managed to strengthen and expand the reach of international law and multilateral cooperation, and we have agreed that no one can stand above the law. We had hoped that the world would never again go back to the distant past, but the war in Ukraine and Russia's flagrant attempt to conquer and annex parts of Ukraine's territory are actions reminiscent of the dark days of fascism and Stalinism. And there is much more in what is happening in Ukraine today that is reminiscent of those dark days. Reports and fact-finding missions from the ground, footage the whole world has seen reveal a basic truth about Russia's actions, an appalling criminal brutality against the civilian population. Innocent men, women, and children in Ukraine, as well as tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, have paid with their lives for Vladimir Putin's war of choice. Millions around the world are going hungry because of Vladimir Putin's war of choice. We condemn Russia's new path of confrontation by announcing a partial mobilization in Russia, by supporting the organization of illegal referenda in 4 Ukrainian territories currently occupied, and by threatening again with the use of weapons of mass destruction. These sham referenda are another blatant violation of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and a serious violation of the UN Charter. We reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and reiterate our call for Russia to completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This is why we must galvanize our forces and continue to help Ukraine defend itself. But that is why, too, we must work to guarantee full accountability for what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It is to provide justice, but this is also to prevent future atrocities. We all tried to prevent this conflict. We could not, but we must not fail to hold Russia accountable. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence, Madame.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Jaishankar, for her statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, Secretary General Guterres. 1 week ago, I stood on the deck of a cargo ship in the port of Odessa, watching 46,000 tons of grain being loaded, bound for Bangladesh. That same day, the total amount of grain exported from Ukrainian ports through the Black Sea Grain Initiative had reached 3 million tons. Ukrainian and UN staff in Odessa spoke to me of their plans to reach 4 million tons of grain per month. Secretary General, as you have said so eloquently, those ships carry not just grain, but the rare commodity of hope. And they represent something else too, the power of multilateralism. In the midst of conflict, the UN and the government of Turkey negotiated a deal to get desperately needed grain out of Ukraine and onto world markets. This happened through dialogue, through using the systems and structures, the norms and institutions that we have painstakingly built over decades to resolve differences, to find solutions, and to deliver for our citizens. These are the principles and institutions that we, all of us around this table, have a solemn commitment to uphold. Madam President, let me recall another moment of hope. In January of this year, the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapons states, including Russia, declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and can never be fought. Those 5 leaders, including President Putin, committed to avoid military confrontations, strengthen stability and predictability, increase mutual understanding and confidence, and pursue constructive dialogue with mutual respect. Just 6 weeks later, Russia launched an unwarranted and illegal further invasion of Ukraine, of another sovereign UN member state, of a neighbor. And now, this week, President Putin again issues threats to use nuclear weapons. Let us be absolutely clear. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the antithesis of the principles of the UN Charter. It is a grave violation of international law. It's an attempt to change internationally recognized borders by use of force. And no sham referendums can change that basic fact. It cannot be allowed to stand. If we fail to hold Russia accountable, we send a signal to large, powerful countries that they can prey on their neighbors with impunity, which is something that every nation on earth should take note of. This is why Ireland yesterday filed a declaration of intervention at the International Court of Justice in Ukraine's case against Russia. It is why we are intervening in Ukraine's case against Russia at the European Court of Human Rights. It is why we have supported action at the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the UN General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council to hold Russia accountable for what it's doing. It's why, with 42 other state parties of the International Criminal Court, we referred the situation in Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor, who's with us here today. It is why we support Ukraine's efforts to establish a compensation and reparations mechanism. And it's why we will work with Ukraine and other partners to examine how we can hold Russia accountable for the crime of aggression. But it is also why this Council collectively must consider how it acts to protect the principles and purpose of the UN Charter itself. No one country, no matter how big or powerful, should have the ability to veto the application of international law for its own aims. Madam President, I said at this Council in April that without accountability, there is no hope for a sustainable peace. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. And I repeat that today. I also recall here in April the shocking evidence I saw in Bucha of Russian forces' disregard for international humanitarian law. That was no fabrication. The bodies that I saw tell a story. 5 months later, more mass graves are being discovered in Izium and in other areas that were until recently under Russian occupation. Attacks by Russian forces on civilians and civilian infrastructure have intensified further since then. The devastating impact of explosive weapons in populated areas is ever more evident, with tens of thousands of homes, hospitals, and schools destroyed. This is why Ireland is seeking the wide endorsement by states of the political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas at a high-level adoption conference in Dublin in November. Madam President, millions of civilians in Ukraine and beyond are being potentially put at risk by Russia's occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I want to repeat the demand of last week's IAEA Board of Governors. Russia must immediately cease all actions against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukrainian authorities must regain full control. The last thing the world needs now is a nuclear accident. Madam President, this conflict can and will end. Our collective responsibility to the UN Charter, to the Pacific settlement of disputes, to the maintenance of international peace and security demands that it ends sooner rather than later. The path to peace is clear. The country that made a deliberate decision to start this conflict must now make the decision to bring it to an end. Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of a fellow UN member state. It must be held accountable for its actions through the international bodies and structures that we together have created for this purpose. It is not solely about Ukraine and its future. This is about the entirety of the UN membership, all of us and all of our countries. If we do not reject Russia's actions in the clearest and most stark terms, we allow the world to be governed by force and not through dialogue and the application of international law. Madam President, this Council must take the lead.
Son Excellence, Monsieur.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Coveney, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Dr. Subrahmanyan Jaishankar, Minister for External Affairs of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by congratulating the French presidency for its able stewardship of the Security Council this month. I also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing and take note of the remarks made by ICC Prosecutor Karim Khan. Allow me, Madam President, to preface my remarks by reminding the Council that India is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, nor a member of the International Criminal Court. Madam President, the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the entire international community. The future outlook appears even more disturbing. The nuclear issue is a particular anxiety. In a globalized world, the impact of the conflict is being felt even in distant regions. We have all experienced its consequences in terms of surging costs and actual shortages of food grains, fertilizers, and fuel. On this score too, there are good grounds to be worried about what awaits us. The global south, especially, is feeling the pain very acutely. We must therefore not initiate measures that further complicates the struggling global economy. And that is why India strongly reiterates the need for an immediate cessation of all hostilities and a return to dialogue and diplomacy. Clearly, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized, this cannot be an era of war. On our part, we are also providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors under economic stress. Turning to the specific topic before the Council today, let me emphasize that even in conflict situations, there can be no justification for violation of human rights or of international law. Where any such acts occur, it is imperative that they are investigated in an objective and independent manner. This was the position we took with regard to the killings in Bucha, and this is the position we take even today. The Council will also recall that we had then supported calls for an independent investigation into the Bucha incident. The fight against impunity is critical to the larger pursuit of securing peace and justice. The Security Council must send an unambiguous and unequivocal message on this count. Politics should never, ever provide cover to evade accountability, nor indeed to facilitate impunity. Regrettably, we have seen this of late in this very chamber when it comes to sanctioning of some of the world's most dreaded terrorists. If egregious attacks committed in broad daylight are left unpunished, this Council must reflect on the signals we are sending on impunity. There must be consistency if we are to ensure credibility. Once again, let me emphasize, Madam President, that the need of the hour is to end this conflict in Ukraine and return to the negotiating table. This Council is the most powerful contemporary symbol of diplomacy. It must continue to live up to its purpose. The global order that we all subscribe to is based on international law, UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. These principles, too, must be upheld without exception. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Dr. Jaishankar, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Michael Moussa Adamo, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Gabon. Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank you, Madam President, for taking the initiative of this meeting on the situation in Ukraine, which is taking place in parallel to the high-level week of the General Assembly under the brand of bold solutions when the world is at a turning point. I thank the Secretary General for his update on the situation in Ukraine, as well as the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Karim Khan, for his briefing. Madam President, humanity loses its way every time it sinks into war and fails to protect civilians from atrocities and horror. The war in Ukraine challenges us on several fronts. It challenges us with the victims in thousands, the ruins of devastation, and the distress of the injured. It challenges us on propaganda, disinformation, or rewriting reality. It challenges us with a nuclear threat and its potentially irreparable consequences. It challenges us with its shockwave on food security on the world scale. Faced with this avalanche of challenges, the peoples of the world turn to the Council for an answer to the multidimensional obstacles that rise on their path, the path of their aspirations to peace and international security. To the women, men, and children who fear a nuclear catastrophe and ask when war in Ukraine will stop, we owe an answer. Our reaction cannot be a confrontation of insults. We must rise to the responsibility entrusted to us in the Charter of the United Nations and the confidence which the peoples of the world have put in this organization. Gabon advocates a constructive dialogue to silence the guns. We are against war, against hate discourse, against outrageous rhetoric which feeds aggression and compromises prospects of peace. Madam President, my country notes with interest that the International Criminal Court has begun investigations into the crimes committed by all parties in the war in Ukraine in order to collect evidence and be able to establish both facts and the responsibilities for the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, both for the allegations of mass killings, forced disappearances and displacement, or deportations. Justice must follow its course in full transparency, impartiality, and independence. All relevant international mechanisms must be used so that the authors of atrocities are made to answer for their crimes before international law. Gabon's message is clear. War is not a state of lawlessness. Parties to conflicts must respect international conventions protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure in wartime, particularly the Geneva Conventions. Madam President, standards applied to the war in Ukraine on all levels should be the same for any armed conflict. And the upsurge of compassion, assistance, and solidarity, which is all too deservedly reserved for the war in Ukraine, should be exactly the same for all victims of armed conflicts. Let us not forget, when the time comes, the fate of many Africans, including young students for whom the path to exile was all too often sown with shame and humiliation. Because of the color of their skin, many were refused the assistance they needed just as much as those sharing with them the same community of suffering, fear, and distress. While many hearts are torn by victims of the war in Ukraine, our hearts beat in time with theirs. And when discrimination is added to the horrors of war, humanity must rise together to strongly denounce it so the double standard is no longer the rule, and so the noise of tanks and firing are unbearable wherever they are heard. Madam President, it is urgent for the humanitarian crisis following the war in Ukraine to be dealt with and for its effects to be rapidly contained. Betting on time is taking the risk of seeing innocent people fall under fire, destroyed civilian infrastructure, more families torn apart, and thousands of war orphans. To conclude, we call on parties to negotiate in respect for humanitarian law, the practices, the principles of the UN Charter, and we support any initiatives reviving the hope for a solution. I thank you, sir, for your statement. I give the floor to Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President, Your Excellency, colleagues. As I understand it, today's meeting was motivated by the intention of several delegations to discuss the topic of impunity in Ukraine. I think this very timely because this is precisely this term, impunity, reflects what has been going on in that country since 2014. The national radical forces, open Russophobes and neo-Nazis came to power then as a result of an armed coup with direct support of Western countries. And right after that, they took the path of lawlessness and totally ignoring main rights and freedoms, the right to life, right of expression, right of access to information, right of conscience, the right to use a native language. And to date, the crimes on the Maidan in February 2014 remain unpunished. Those who perpetrated the horrific tragedy in Odessa on the 2nd of May of 2014 have not been found or punished. At the time, at the House of Labor Unions, dozens were burned alive and died. In the same categories of political murders of Olesa Buzyn, Pavle Shermet, and other public figures and journalists. In spite of that, there's an attempt today to impose on us a completely different narrative about Russian aggression as the origin of all the tragedy. This ignores the fact that for over 8 years, the Ukrainian army and fighters from the nationalist formations killed and continue to kill inhabitants of Donbas with impunity simply because they refused to recognize the result of the coup d'etat in Kiev. They decided to uphold their rights, which were guaranteed by the Ukrainian constitution, including the right to freely use Russian, their mother tongue. Just recall how in 2015, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Yatsenyuk, declared that in Donbas, non-humans live in Donbas, inhumans. And the current president, Mr. Zelensky, did not go very far from that, who in an interview last September, when he was asked what he thought about the people who live in Donbas, he said, well, you know, there are people and sometimes there are species, they're beings. This seems to be a very common reference of the Ukrainian authorities. They declared all those who don't agree there as terrorists, and for 8 years, the Kiev regime has been conducting a military operation against the peaceful civilians. And by the way, in Ukraine for many years now, total mobilization of all adult population, including women, is being conducted in order to recruit them into the ranks of nationalist battalions and the armed forces. Now, by cynically declaring its commitment to the Minsk agreements, the Kiev's authorities overtly sabotaged their implementation. There was financial transport blockade of Donbas. People were denied their pensions, their subsidies, their access to education. They were denied their basic civil rights, including those that were guaranteed by the international pacts of 1966. So then Mr. Zelensky, having been tired of pretending, stated that it was impossible to implement the Minsk agreement. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko, just a couple months ago, proudly stated that the Minsk agreements, which he signed, neither him nor no one else in the Ukraine had any intention of implementing these, that these agreements were simply needed to win time in order to obtain weapons from the West for the war against Russia. And the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Danilov, said something very similar. Of course, the Kiev regime owes its impunity to its Western sponsors, first of all, Germany and France, but also the United States. Instead of pushing the Kiev authorities to implement the Minsk agreement, Berlin and Paris and Washington cynically ignored the growing threats of Kiev to resolve the problem of Donbas by force, the so-called Plan B. Over the past few years, the Kiev regime has conducted a frontal assault on the Russian language. It brazenly trampled on the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. Scandalous language laws were enacted on education in 2016, on ensuring the role of Ukrainian language as a state language in 2019. On the comprehensive general secondary education in 2020, on native peoples of Ukraine in 2021. All these laws are aimed at ousting the Russian language. In essence, it's complete ban. At the same time, laws were adopted that promoted the theory and practice of Nazism. The timid recommendations of the Venetian Commission of the Council of Europe and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the OSCE High Commissioner on minorities on amending the language legislation were simply ignored by Kiev. And these multilateral structures at the same time didn't find the courage, or they were not allowed, to convince the Kiev authorities to fulfill their obligations they undertook in the area of human rights. The Ministry of Education of Ukraine has excluded Russian literature from the school curriculum. Books are being destroyed, just as in Nazi Germany. And ethnic Russians are being subject to intolerance. And today, the officials from Ukraine have no longer even tried to hide their anti-Russian feelings, calling on the killing of Russians. Just a few examples. Mr. Vrublevsky, the Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, who's now in Kiev, just a month ago declared in an interview, and I quote, "We're trying to kill Russians, as many Russians as possible. The more we kill today, the fewer our children will need to kill." End of quote. Did anyone notice this quote? Just earlier this April, the mayor of Dnipro, Filatov, said something similar. The time of cold-blooded fury has come. Now we have a full moral right to calmly and with a clear mind to kill these non-humans around the world for as long as possible and as many as possible. End of quote. On the 13th of September of this year, just recently, Mr. Danilov stated, and I quote, "In towns where the Ukrainian armed forces enter, people will undergo Ukrainization without taking into account their views. This will apply not only to Russians, but representatives of other nationalities." And if you want to study any other language, such as Romanian, Polish, Ivrit, please go ahead, but not to be financed by our state. You can do it at your own expense. You can improve your educational level at your own expense. End of quote. Is there any need to say that all these Russophobic statements have remained unpunished? And we're not even talking about Russophobia here. This individual spoke about representatives of other ethnic groups that live in Ukraine. And of course, the ultimate was the interview with Mr. Zelensky on the 5th of August, who suggested to everyone who feels that they're Russian for the good of their children and grandchildren to get the hell out and to go to Russia. And I think the decisions that have been adopted by a whole range of regions of Ukraine about conducting referendums are the result of his advice. And under the guise of combating Russian aggression and separatism, Ukraine is strengthening its persecution of dissidents. In March, a ban on the activity of 11 political parties under the pretext of their links to Russia. Opposition Russian language television channels have been closed for any attempt to provide an alternative view to the official view. Journalists are persecuted. Madame Berezhnaya, a well-known public official who has often spoken at the UN and the OBSE, is in the prison of the security services. We have no doubt that Ukraine has become a completely totalitarian Nazi-like state where the norms of international humanitarian law are trampled on. There's no surprise that the armed forces and the national battalions are using the tactic of terrorists, using peaceful civilians as human shield. And here, what's particularly cynical is the position of states that are pumping Ukraine full of weapons and training their soldiers. The goal is obvious. They're clearly stating it, to drag out the fighting as long as possible in spite of the victims and destruction in order to wear down and weaken Russia. That policy means the direct involvement of the West in the conflict and makes them a party to the conflict. Intentional fomenting of this conflict by the collective West remains unpunished. Of course, you won't punish yourselves, sir. We have no illusions that today the armed forces of Russia and the militias of Lugansk and Donetsk are being opposed not only by the neo-Nazi formations of the Kiev regime, but the military machine of the collective West. And in real time, the regime of real time using modern systems of weapons, ships, satellites, drones. NATO is providing intelligence to the Ukrainian armed forces and stating that, convincing them that Russia should be defeated on the field of battle. The official representatives of the European Union have stated this, and Russia should be punished by having any sovereignty stripped from it. This isn't even latent racism, but overt racism. Against the backdrop of mass shelling of towns and cities of Donbass, Mr. Zelensky is overjoyed at the effectiveness of Western weapons. Here's a quote: "At last we feel how powerfully Western artillery has begun to operate. The weapons that we've received from our Western partners, its accuracy is exactly what we need," he cynically stated. At the same time, there were no military or strategic targets located in the towns that were shelled. Only peaceful citizens of Donbass are suffering. Since the end of July, the armed forces are lobbing mortar rounds to the center of Donetsk and its environs that are banned. They're lobbing banned anti-personnel rounds called lobe or blade. This violates a convention in 1997 on the ban on anti-personnel mines ratified by Ukraine, as well as the second protocol of the Geneva Convention on Conventional Weapons. Such outrages remain unpunished because the United States and their allies, with the connivance of international human rights institutes, have been covering up the crimes of the Kiev regime based on the policy of Zelensky might be a bastard, but he's our bastard. The inconvenient truth that darkens the image of Ukraine as the victim of Russian aggression is carefully hushed up and sometimes deleted. Even Western human rights organization Amnesty International, which it's difficult to accuse of sympathies to Russia, has been severely criticized and called an agent of the Kremlin, simply because in its report it's confirmed facts about the fact that Kiev places heavy weapons at civilian facilities. Also, the criminal shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant remain unpunished, even though from the 1st of September, representatives of the IAEA have been present there, and it's not very difficult to establish who's guilty for the shelling. And I just want to recall that the visit of the IAEA mission to this power plant was artificially delayed, even though already on the 3rd of June, all details were agreed, and the mission could have gone to the power plant already. And then it was a very unpleasant situation where the DESA, Department of Security of the UN, refused to give authorization to the specific itinerary, and then this was not a very honest actions. It simply delayed the visit to the Zaporozhye power plant by 2 months, even by 3 months, practically 3 months. We're very also concerned about the fate of Russian soldiers who were taken prisoners. There are very many examples of torture, including violation of international humanitarian law. I'm sure that all those who are interested in what actually happened saw a video of the torture atrocities by Ukrainian neo-Nazis against Russian soldiers who were thrown to the ground with their hands tied and were shot in the head. Did anyone here comment on this the crime at all? We have many witnesses of these criminal activities by the Kiev regime that have been happening since 2014. Russian law enforcement bodies cooperating with their colleagues from Donetsk and the Luhansk republics are investigating these thoroughly. Over 220 individuals have been found to be complicit, including the high command of the Ukrainian armed forces, commanders of units who were shelled, the civilian population. Also, there were cases against mercenaries from citizens of UK, Canada, United States, Netherlands, etc. I can assure you that all perpetrators, independently of their nationality, will be held accountable. I also want to draw your attention to the following. When Russian and Ukrainian negotiators at the end of March practically reached an agreement on the parameters of an agreement proposed by Kiev. Just a couple of days later, the tragedy in Bucha occurred. The fact that it was staged leaves no doubt in anyone's mind. And I want to draw your attention, colleagues, that Western colleagues, right after that staged event, immediately cried outrage and introduced a new package of sanctions, spuriously accusing us of killing innocent civilians. Since then, when that propaganda operation was conducted, no one has mentioned Bucha other than us. And once again, in the presence of the Secretary General and the ministers, I would address you and say, please demand the Ukrainian authorities to make a simple step, take a simple step to publish information about those individuals whose bodies were shown in Bucha. I've been asking this for the past month. Secretary General, please use your authority for this. It would be very useful to get to the bottom of this episode. And of course, we also notice the increased activity of international justice with regard to Ukraine. There's supposedly efforts to investigate crimes committed in Ukraine that are ascribed to Russian authorities. All this is simply a very a propaganda operation. I just want to recall that neither the coup d'etat in 2014 or the tragedy in Odessa or the shelling of Donetsk or any other crimes have led to any reaction from the International Criminal Court. And by the way, this International Criminal Court, there were some 3,000 references sent to the International Criminal Court against crimes committed against the inhabitants of ICC. There has been no reaction. And it seems that the ICC has now received instructions to step up its activity. We have no confidence in the work of this body. For the past 8 months, we were waiting for steps to be taken against impunity in Ukraine, and we don't expect anything more from this institution or a whole range of other international institutions. Everything I've said today simply confirms that the decision to conduct the special military operation was inevitable. We have said this more than once. We've provided a huge number of facts which show how Ukraine prepared to play the role of anti-Russia as a staging ground to create threats against Russian security. And I can assure you that we will never accept this. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lavrov, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. James Cleverly, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Khan, thank you. 77 years ago, UN members agreed solemn principles in the UN Charter, vital for international peace and security. They undertook to refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. Yet 7 months ago, President Putin invaded Ukraine illegally and without justification. He ignored the resounding pleas for peace that I heard in this council on the 17th of February. Since then, Ukrainians' spirit of defense and defiance in the protection of their country continues to inspire free peoples and nations. Every day, the devastating consequences of Russia's invasion become more clear. UN agencies have confirmed more than 14,000 civilian casualties so far, and the actual total is likely to be much higher. More than 17 million Ukrainians in humanitarian need, 7 million displaced within Ukraine, and more than 7 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe. We see the mounting evidence of Russian atrocities against civilians, including indiscriminate shelling and targeted attacks on over 200 medical facilities and 40 educational institutions, and horrific acts of sexual violence. We see from the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that in parts of Ukraine currently under Russian control, civilians are subject to torture, arbitrary detention, and forced deportation to Russia. And we have seen more grisly discoveries in Izium. And it's not just Ukrainians who are the victims. President Putin's war has spread hardship and food insecurity across the globe, plunging millions of the world's most vulnerable into hunger and famine. And once again, as we've seen here today, Russia has sought to deny responsibility. It has tried to lay the blame on those who have rightly imposed sanctions on President Putin's regime in response to his illegal actions. Let us be clear, we are not sanctioning food. It is Russia's actions that are preventing food and fertilizer getting to developing countries. It is Russia's tactics and bombs that are to blame for destroying Ukraine's farms, infrastructure, and delaying its exports. I sat here in February, listening to the Russian representative assuring this council that Russia had no intention of invading its neighbor. We now know that was a lie. And today, I have listened to further installments of Russia's catalogues of distortions, dishonesty, and disinformation. He has left the chamber. I'm not surprised. I don't think Mr. Lavrov wants to hear the collective condemnation of this council. But we saw through him then, and we saw through him again today. We have information, which means that we know that Russia is about to hold sham referenda on sovereign Ukrainian territory with no basis in law, under the threat of violence, after mass displacements of people in areas that voted overwhelmingly for Ukrainian independence. We know what Vladimir Putin is doing. He is planning to fabricate the outcome of those referenda. He is planning to use that to annex sovereign Ukrainian territory. And he is planning to use it as a further pretext to escalate his aggression. That is what he plans to do. And we call on all countries to reject this charade and to refuse to recognize any results. We are used to seeing Russian lies and distortions. But let us listen to the testimony of Ukrainians who tell us the truth, who tell us the reality of President Putin's war. Dr. Olena Yuzvak, her husband, Ole, and their 22-year-old son, Dmitry, were abducted by Russian forces from their home in Hostomel near Bucha in March. Russian soldiers shot Ole twice in the legs before they were all blindfolded and bundled into an armored personnel carrier. And I want you to hear Olna's story in her own words, and I quote, "First, they took us to a bombed out house. The Russian soldiers kept saying they were going to kill us. My husband was left for hours lying on the floor in the pool of his blood. I don't know why. We'd done nothing wrong. Then they took my son away from us. I don't know where. I don't know if we'll ever see him again. I just want my boy back." End of quote. Olena's story and those of many others tell us the truth, the real truth. This is a war of annexation, a war of conquest, to which President Putin now wants to send even more of Russia's young men and women, making peace even less likely. Mr. Putin must understand the world is watching and we will not give up. Of members of the Security Council, we must unequivocally reject Russia's attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. We must make clear to President Putin that his attack on the Ukrainian people must stop, that there can be no impunity for those perpetrating atrocities, and that he must withdraw from Ukraine and restore regional and global stability. If he chose to, he could stop this war, a war which has done untold damage to the Ukrainian and the Russian peoples. His war is an assault on Ukraine, an assault on the UN Charter, and an assault on the international norms that protect us all. So, we stand with our Ukrainian friends for as long as it takes, because Ukraine's fight for freedom is the world's fight for freedom. It is our fight for freedom. And if Ukraine's sovereignty and territory are not respected, then no country is truly secure. These are the reasons why Ukraine can and must win. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cleverly, for his statement. I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Shirley Okorobochiwe, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
President, Excellencies, let me thank France for organizing this high-level meeting. I would also like to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for setting the tone for this meeting with his very clear statement. We welcome also the briefing from Mr. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC. The world has been united since this council's referral over Darfur in Resolution 1593, 2005, nearly 2 decades ago, that impunity anywhere poses serious threats to international peace and security, the international legal order, and our multilateral system. We have systematically reinforced our institutions and defined conduct and sanctions to expose, prevent, or punish those acts or behavior that defy the norms we are committed to live by. No state, however powerful, should get a pass. To do so unravels a central tenet of our global civilization. It puts at stake the lives and liberties of those less powerful, wherever they live. That is why the members of this council must act in an urgent and unified manner to end the near paralysis of the council and the war in Ukraine. The toll of that war is intolerable, and the lack of unified resolve risks making our universal organization an enabling factor for impunity in Ukraine. The damage to the standing of the Charter may be incalculable. Ghana is especially concerned about the intensification of the war in Ukraine across several lines, with civilian populated areas and civilian infrastructure being the targets of bombardments. We regret that the basic laws which govern the conduct of modern warfare and protect ordinary people who are caught in the crossfires of war have not been respected. We are distressed by the diverse, horrifying, and painful humanitarian threats which have accompanied the war. Some 14 million people, mostly women and children, have been displaced from their homes and face heightened risk of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Human trafficking, filtration processes, and forced disappearances, torture, and other violations of the rights and freedoms of the people are widespread. We remain gravely concerned by the manifest threats of a nuclear episode, whether by accident or deliberate action, because of the constant military engagements around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The disregard for the requisites for nuclear safety and security, including for the delineation of a safe zone, are deplorable. And we support the efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency to avert a nuclear catastrophe. With the rising death toll, civilian casualties, and growing reports of war crimes and other human rights violations, we must uphold our responsibility as a council and send a clear message that perpetrators of atrocities would be held to account. The suffering in Ukraine is abhorrent and should not be dismissed as the mere consequence of war. To do so, we would be endorsing the atrocities and sanctioning impunity. In this regard, we underscore the importance of ensuring accountability for all war crimes committed in Ukraine. Accountability is fundamental to preventing impunity. We must affirm our determination that the litany of atrocious acts that have taken place in Ukraine would be submitted to thorough, transparent, and independent investigations to establish the facts and for the attribution of international crimes to their perpetrators. Ghana remains supportive of international accountability measures, including the various investigative processes being undertaken by the ICC and the Human Rights Council. We believe that in seeking criminal accountability and justice for the victims of the war in Ukraine, the important questions about international remedy and reparation measures, especially for victims of conflict-related sexual abuses, must be addressed. We also express our support for the United Nations early recovery and resilience programs already being undertaken. Madam President, we have expressed several times our principled position against the aggression on Ukraine, which we consider to be a disregard for the rules of international law and the principles of the Charter. Ukraine, as a sovereign state and a member of this organization, has every right, we believe, and indeed a responsibility to defend its territorial integrity and political independence. We recognize the tremendous courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people. Ghana does not and will not recognize any territory that is unilaterally and forcefully required or acquired as dismembered from a sovereign entity. We reiterate the call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its operations, withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, and respect its neighbors' sovereignty and political independence. The need for a credible pathway for a genuine diplomatic process is urgent. The barrel of the gun does not provide such a pathway. It only leads to needless loss of lives and destruction on both sides. Indeed, the costs of the war have been high, not only for the parties, but also for the rest of the world. As the President of Ghana said yesterday in his statement at the General Assembly, I quote, "Every bullet, every bomb, every shell that hits a target in Ukraine hits our pockets and our economies in Africa," unquote. In this regard, let me place on record Ghana's appreciation for the good offices of the Secretary General and other international actors to leverage life-saving humanitarian interventions at critical times of the war. We already note some positive impacts from the Black Sea Grain Initiative and urge the continuous and unrestricted shipment of grains to countries facing food insecurity. We encourage all stakeholders to reach an early agreement for the export of Russian fertilizers and crop products, especially needed for agrarian-dependent economies. Madam President, let me conclude with an appeal. In a week when the eyes of the world are on us and millions around the world look to the United Nations for leadership and hope, we must send a strong message that impunity will not be tolerated, that we need to act through concerted diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine. I thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank Her Excellency, Madam Boche, for her statement, and I give the floor to Mr. Carlos Alberto Franco Franca, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Madam President, I want to thank France for having organized this session.
Ukraine affects us all, even in regions far from where hostilities are taking place. The Security Council is the appropriate forum to seek a solution that ensures lasting peace. This week marks 7 months since the start of the conflict. Tens of thousands of people, many of them innocent civilians, lost their lives. There are millions of refugees and internally displaced persons whose return to their homes remains uncertain and who, with the approach of winter, are faced with the prospect of a worsening humanitarian crisis. Over these 7 months, this Council has received numerous reports of serious human rights violations in the conflict zone, including against vulnerable groups, women and children. Brazil condemns the abuses and defends an impartial investigation of the facts so that those responsible are held accountable for their actions. We also reiterate our call for full respect for international humanitarian law by all parties. Madame la Présidente, we have an urgent task before us: to engage the parties in dialogue in order to secure an immediate ceasefire and the opening of negotiations for a peace agreement. The continuation of the hostilities endangers the lives of innocent civilians and jeopardizes the food and energy security of millions of families in other regions, especially in developing countries. The risks of escalation arising for the current dynamics of the conflict are simply too great, and its consequences for the world order unpredictable. Only diplomacy brings the prospect of viable solutions to conflicts between states. It is not the time to accentuate divisions or isolate parties. The priority of this Council must be to create conditions for the parties to engage in negotiations for a peaceful solution to the conflict. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence, Monsieur França.
I thank Mr. Franca for his statement, and I give the floor to Her Excellency, Madam Reem Al-Hashimi, Minister of State for International Cooperation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, at the outset, I would like to thank you for organizing this important meeting. I would like to also thank His Excellency, the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and His Excellency, Mr. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, for their valuable briefings. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine clearly generated different reactions across the international community. For some, it warned of a paralyzed multilateral system. For others, concern over the rise of bygone existential threats. And finally, there are those for whom the war presaged a return of historical polarization with all its portents for the world. Those differences were further illustrated by a divergence in states' responses to this war, as this council and organization have heard repeatedly. Yet, those disparities existed alongside a unified expression of fidelity to international law and a need to respect it, a recognition of its function to separate a civilized international order from its antithesis. International law, as the UN Charter articulates, regulates the conduct and practice of states according to the principles of sovereignty, independence, good neighborhood, and territorial integrity, reinforcing in the process the security and prosperity of states regardless of their size or might. Madam President, the UAE will not deviate from its unequivocal call and its unwavering appeal for all parties to this war to abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, to respect its limits and to implement its provisions. In this context, the reports of daily violations are a cause of grave concern, especially regarding the war's repercussions on civilians. We also emphasize here the situation of women and children, especially those forced into displacement, who are consistently reported to suffer from sexual violence and exploitation, including by organized crime and human trafficking networks. All of us are aware of the disproportionate severity and violence that war and conflict inflict upon women and girls. Therefore, we welcome all ongoing efforts, including by UN agencies, to respond to the humanitarian situation while taking into account the unique impacts of the war on women and girls. While the immediate imperative is a cessation of hostilities, peace remains our ultimate goal, and its sustainability requires comprehensive reconciliation predicated on accountability and justice for the war's victims. We also reiterate that the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in conflict resolution and peace building is crucial, not only to reflect their distinct experience of war, but also their centrality to building peace. Madam President, the UAE remains steadfast in its approach, urging dialogue, de-escalation, and calm, and encouraging cooperation and consensus building to ensure stability in and among states. We are also reminded here of a long-standing observation. Repeated deviations from the law without consequence normalize the practice and create a race to the bottom. Finally, Madam President, I restate the UAE's call to both parties and all relevant stakeholders to pursue a peaceful end to this war through constructive and inclusive dialogue, which necessitates open lines of communication and a viable off-ramp to preserve the prospects of a diplomatic solution. It is evident that the world before us, in all its diversity, is concerned with the consequences of this war on the international system, on food and energy security, and on the risks of an escalation confrontation. Therefore, we must carry out the duties entrusted to us and cooperate to overcome the world's most pressing challenges, rather than seeing war and conflict set us back further. This approach and our promotion of it is the conclusion drawn from our experience in the Middle East, where people have been battered by a relentless insistence on zero-sum hegemony and the pursuit of narrow self-interest. This has left and will only leave destruction. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Madame Hashimi.
I thank Madam Al-Hashimi for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. George Orina, Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Madam President, Excellencies. Madam President, Kenya's delegation commends you and France for the able stewardship of the Security Council during the month of September. I thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Mr. Karim Khan for their updates on the situation in the Ukraine. The war in the Ukraine is a serious breach of the United Nations Charter. The obligation to respect the territorial integrity of all member states will be further undermined should any action be taken to change the legal character of the areas in eastern Ukraine. We are in a moment of grave danger to international peace and security. The escalation of the war the international community feared is underway. There are now clear threats being issued about the potential deployment of weapons of mass destruction in the conflict. On the battlefield, civilians are being subjected to serious harm in contravention of the fundamental international law and human rights obligations. It is a priority of the utmost urgency that national authorities subject their soldiers to severe disciplinary action for any abuses, especially on civilians and captured combatants. Military commanders should surrender those suspected for such atrocities to the relevant authorities for prosecution. All the parties, including those making allegations of human rights abuses, or all those against whom the allegations are made, should agree to prompt, independent, and impartial investigations. Even as we justly condemn and call for accountability of war-related violations, we know that the truest protection of civilians is to stop the war. In this regard, Kenya calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Active hostilities should be replaced by a mediated agreement that secures the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, while